A Flash Outside the Off-Stump. Episode 11. They have got a lot of white people in this country. 1900 saw the arrival of the first representative West Indies side to tour England. The team was led by Orca Warner, a white Trinidadian, whose brother Pelham, normally known as Plum, would one day captain England. In contrast to modern-day West Indies sides, the majority of the players were white, although 5 of the 15-man party were black. 2 of these, Tommy Burton and Float Woods, were professional bowlers, while the other 3, Lebrun Constantine, Delmont Hines and Charles Ollivierre, were classed as amateurs. As with Ranjit Singhi, classing players as amateurs identified them as gentlemen, which by the conventions of the time would have gone a long way towards ensuring that they were usually treated courteously. Cricket in the West Indies tended to be more integrated than in India, and although individual clubs usually drew their members from particular races and classes, there was a long tradition of interracial matches between clubs. However, there was a considerable variance in attitude towards the extent to which interracial cricket was encouraged in the different colonies which made up the British West Indies. At one end of the spectrum was Barbados. As England's oldest colony in the Caribbean, it had a long-established white planter class, which jealously clung to its perceived privileges. One of these was the honour of representing the island in inter-colonial cricket matches, and in Barbados it was understood that only white men could join the Barbados team, no matter how good their standard of cricket. At the other end of the scale was Trinidad, where, although local clubs were still largely based on racial and class distinctions, it was accepted that the island team would be selected on merit, regardless of ethnicity. It was a policy that paid off for Trinidad in abundance. Not only did they emerge as the dominant force in inter-island cricket by utilising the best of their own black players, but they were able to attract talented players from other islands who had encountered a glass ceiling at home due to their ethnicity. Ollivierre had come to Trinidad from St Vincent, and Woods and Hines from Barbados, as had another bowler, C.P. Cumberbatch, who had played for the West Indies against Lord Hawke's touring side in 1897. Similarly, Tommy Burton, although originating in Barbados, played his cricket in British Guiana, which was closer to Trinidad in its attitude to integration. Lord Hawke was an immensely influential figure in the cricketing world. A former Cambridge University player, he was captain of Yorkshire from 1883 until 1910, winning the county championship 8 times. He was evangelical in his belief that cricket was a civilising influence which should be actively promoted around the world, and consequently raised and led a number of overseas tours, visiting India, Australia, America, New Zealand, Argentina and South Africa, as well as the West Indies over the course of his career. Although there had been a previous English tour to the West Indies led by Robert Slade Lucas of Middlesex in 1895, this had been as much a social tour as a cricketing one, with the emphasis on playing local white amateur teams and 11s representing the combined West Indies. This tour had been the brainchild of Dr. R.B. Anderson, a Lincolnshire doctor who had worked in Tobago for 28 years and was an enthusiastic supporter of West Indies cricket. He had hoped to persuade Lord Hawke to captain the visitors in 1895, knowing that Hawke's presence would be both an inspiration for Caribbean cricketers and provide useful publicity and introductions back in England. In the event, Hawke was unavailable, but the large crowds and enthusiastic response from all sections of West Indian society ensured that a second tour would go ahead, next time featuring a stronger team of county cricketers led by Hawke himself. Dr. Anderson was in England during the 1895 West Indies tour, and Cricket magazine was able to interview him at some length about the state of the game in Trinidad and Tobago. He was at pains to emphasise that, as in England, cricket in the Caribbean was a cohesive force played by all classes, from the highest plantation owner to the lowliest field labourer, and when asked to name the best bowlers in Tobago had no hesitation.
There was Bain, a coloured, and Stanley, a black man. The first was a round arm with a quick delivery and a splendid wrist action. In business he was a dispenser. Stanley was also a good bowler and only a field labourer. One of the best effects of cricket was that it brought all classes together in a common love of sport, and I never wish to see a better feeling exist than obtained amongst cricketers of high and low degree.
Dr. Anderson's response is revealing. It tells us that he is committed to a multiracial view of cricket, and does not have any difficulty with the notion that a player did not have to be white to be the best. But it also hints at the idea that there might be something of a racial divide between batting and bowling, a theme to which we will return shortly. His answer also gives us a glimpse into the way in which colour and class tended to be linked in the Caribbean. Bain is of mixed descent, and as a dispenser, or pharmacist, is one of the educated middle class. Stanley, identified as black, is a field labourer. This is not to say that colour was the only determinant of class, or that a black person could not also join the middle classes, but as a rule of thumb, skin tone was often taken as an indicator of one's status, and sensitivity about the interplay between colour and class was at its greatest among West Indians of mixed race, as Guyanese writer Edgar Mittelholzer, himself a member of the coloured middle class, later recalled.
The pure whites were a very small minority and simply could not afford to show open discrimination or practice any unpleasant form of segregation. Indeed, sad to relate, it was my own class, people of coloured admixture but of fair or olive complexion, who dispensed any colour snobbery it was possible to dispense. It was my class which looked down upon the East Indian sugar plantation workers. Coolies, we called them, whether they were labourers or eventually became doctors or barristers or civil servants. It was my class which considered the Portuguese social inferiors because of their background of door-to-door peddling, rum shops, saltgoods shops and pawn shops, and their low standard of living. We, too, treated the Chinese sweet sellers and shopkeepers with condescension because of their poor immigrant status. We even looked with a certain distinct aloofness upon the young Englishmen who came out to serve as sugar plantation overseers. We deemed them white riffraff. And as for Negroes, it goes without saying that they were serving people. That was an accepted tradition dating from slavery days.
Cricket had been played in the West Indies at least as far back as the second half of the 18th century, and there were some claims that it even dated back to the 17th century in Barbados and Jamaica. The game's introduction thus predated the abolition of slavery by some time. We have an indication that it was played by slaves as well as the white inhabitants because of a belt buckle depicting a slave playing cricket, which was found in Scotland in 1980 and thought to have been taken there by the Hothams, a family with property in Barbados and Scotland 200 years earlier. The earliest games were probably played by white plantation owners and members of the military on fields cleared in the bush. As balls were knocked out of the field into the thick surrounding undergrowth, it is speculated that slaves were dispatched to retrieve the balls, and that a degree of competition emerged between them to see who could throw back the ball with a high degree of accuracy or from longer distances. In some respects, this has parallels to the way that Parsi boys first became familiar with cricket in India by retrieving balls for officers on the Maidan. In England, one of the broad early class distinctions in the game was that gentlemen tended to bat and players to bowl. From early on, aristocratic players had been hiring professionals to bowl practice balls to them, and it seems that this practice was also taken up in the colonies, with slaves being required to bowl to their masters for batting practice. It is speculated in Clem Ciceran's excellent book Muscular Learning that one reason the West Indies was to develop a reputation for producing fast bowlers was that in the early days of cricket it provided an excellent and legitimate pressure valve whereby the enslaved could both release tension and assert their freedom by bowling hard and fast at their masters and their sons. By 1895, while most, but not all, whites in the Caribbean were happy to play against players from other races domestically, they mostly played for all white clubs themselves. Furthermore, when Slade Lucas and his team arrived, the cricketing authorities on most islands took the decision that only amateur players should be selected for representative matches against the tourists, effectively excluding black professional bowlers. This was not necessarily in line with the hopes of Dr. Anderson, and it was notable that Trinidad ignored this trend and selected a mixed-race team, as did St Kitts. It was also notable that Trinidad was one of the few sides that were successful against the tourists. 2 years later, when Lord Hawke brought a team largely composed of county players to the West Indies, its only 2 defeats were against the same Trinidadian side. and Plum Warner identified the bowling combination of Woods and Cumberbatch as being instrumental to their success, writing influential pieces in both The Sportsman and Wisden extolling the virtues of the pair. That Trinidad was the colony with the most advanced attitude towards integrated selection reflects its history and social conditions. A former Spanish colony, it had been extensively settled by French Creoles before becoming a British possession, and although slavery had been practised on the island, it had not taken hold to the same extent as in colonies such as Jamaica and Barbados. The French Creole element to Trinidadian culture meant that there was less of a history of confrontation between the races. Additionally, because Trinidad had become British just as the empire was turning away from being a major slave trader to becoming fervently abolitionist, the families who came out from the UK to administer it had a very different attitude to race than the old established plantation families on some other islands. By the 1890s, the Warners were one of Trinidad's most influential families, and Orca Warner shared Dr. Anderson's vision that cricket was a sport which could unite the West Indies, and that its representative side should include the best the islands had to offer, regardless of colour. When Warner selected his party to tour England 3 years later, it was not without controversy, and once again the issue was the different standards applied to racial inclusion in Barbados and Trinidad. The catalyst for this was the inclusion of Delmont Hines in the party. Although Hines was black and an apprentice house painter, he was a member of Spartan, a Barbadian club for coloured members of the professional classes. His membership of Spartan split the club, many of its members being opposed to his inclusion because of both his colour and class. When a majority decided that his skill as a cricketer warranted his inclusion despite these concerns, they found some of the elite white clubs on the island no longer willing to play against them, and even some of their own players refused to turn out in the same side. In the short term, these opponents had effectively shot themselves in the foot by withdrawing, and Spartan won the Barbados Championship that year. But the authorities had responded by recasting the rules to ban current or former professionals from the championship. There were no professionals in Barbados, but the rule change was specifically aimed at Hines because he had been a groundsman, and this was close enough as far as white Barbadians were concerned. When Hines was not only selected for the West Indies but designated as an amateur, this was too much for Barbados batsman Hallam Cole, who withdrew from the team in protest, ostensibly in a row over the difference between amateur and professional status, but really because he could not countenance playing in the same team as a black man. Hines went on the tour, but the protracted arguments beforehand had dented his confidence, and his form in England was not up to his previous standard. Ultimately, the withdrawal of Cole worked well for Warner's aim of creating a more inclusive and representative side, an idea to which some of the other white players in the team were equally committed. Percy Goodman was also from Barbados but had a very different attitude to Cole and had publicly campaigned for more integrated cricket in Barbados. And George Learmond from British Guiana, who despite being white had chosen to play for Spartan, was another liberal-minded player who made such an impression on his black teammate Lebrun Constantine, with his friendly and open manner, that he named his son Learie in his honour. The West Indies came to England in a similar spirit to the Parsees 14 years earlier, a sentiment echoed by Warner at the formal welcome before the opening match with London, where he remarked to W.G. Grace,
"We have come to learn, sir."
Unfortunately, this was grossly misrepresented by a cartoon in the following day's edition of The Star, in which the familiar towering bearded figure of W.G. is seen surrounded by hideous caricatures of crying pygmies with the caption,
"We have come to learn, sir."
It was neither funny nor helpful. The MCC had decided in advance of the tour that West Indies cricket was not of a standard for the matches to be regarded as first class. This was perhaps odd, given that it was a side representing colonies which were individually recognised as first class, but the tourists' first few results seemed to validate their decision. There were heavy defeats against W.G. Grace's London County side, Worcestershire, Warwickshire and the MCC, although Constantine scored a fine century at Lord's, and by the end of the match Burton and Woods were finding their form. A win against minor counties was followed by an innings defeat against Gloucestershire, and then a win against Leicestershire, and then further defeats against Nottinghamshire, Wiltshire and Lancashire. At the end of their first month they had won 2 but lost 8. In mid-July, however, their fortunes took a turn for the better, and a month later the Morning Post was able to report:
The visitors from the West Indies brought their tour to a close on Saturday with a capital victory, and on the whole they may be sincerely congratulated on the form they have shown during the past 3 months. They were slow to settle down, and when the first 4 matches on their programme ended in defeat, people somewhat hastily concluded that the team had overestimated their powers. However, when once they became acclimatised, Mr. Warner's men showed vastly improved form, as may be judged from the fact that after Lancashire had beaten them in the middle of July, they were not again defeated, but won and drew 4 of their concluding engagements, holding their own well in every instance. Perhaps their best performance was that against Leicestershire in June, and they were also seen to great advantage in the Hampshire and Surrey matches. Ollivierre, Constantine, Cox and Goodman all have excellent batting records, while Woods and Burton formed a distinctly formidable pair of bowlers. The team fielded uncommonly well and habitually showed a keenness which might well be imitated by some of our county 11s.
It is particularly interesting to note that from a predominantly white team, it is mainly the black members that are singled out for praise. This may or may not tell us that black players had to be of a higher standard to merit selection in the first place, but it certainly implies that cricket writers at least were prepared to recognise talent regardless of skin colour. Float Woods had been particularly exuberant on the tour and was seen as a larger-than-life character, becoming the subject of several stories. During the team's first match at the Crystal Palace, he remarked to the manager,
"Mr. Knock, they have got a lot of white people in this country."
It perhaps strikes us as comical, but emphasises that Britain at this time was far from multicultural. It must have been odd for Woods to come from a small island where whites were a tiny minority to a heavily industrialised country where there were millions of people but hardly a non-white face to be seen. CLR James recounts another anecdote about Woods from the West Indies match against Gloucestershire at Bristol. The hosts made 619, with Gilbert Jessop scoring 157 in just 1 hour. Woods had bowled 33 overs and taken no wickets for 141 runs, and pleaded with Warner to be allowed to take his boots off, convinced that if only he could do so he would be able to play to his true nature and capture Jessop's wicket. While Warner, anxious to project a civilised image for the team, repeatedly refused permission, and Woods was forced to endure the dual martyrdom of sore feet and terrible bowling figures. It's a great story, but unfortunately that's all it is. The original version of it was written by Plum Warner about an incident in 1897 in Trinidad, and involved Woods playing in a pair of tennis shoes with the soles cut out, and even this probably contained a good deal of poetic licence. After a shaky start, the West Indies had made a good impression in England, and they returned home to a warm welcome. Many English spectators had been impressed by the athleticism and demeanour of the West Indies team, and the tour became the first step on the path which was to bring them back on another tour 6 years later, and eventually lead to Test status in 1928. During the tour, Constantine had scored the first century by a West Indian batsman in England, and Ollivier's batting had earned him a well-paid job in Derbyshire while he qualified as an amateur for that county. The team had earned the respect of their opponents and laid the groundwork for the future, but the biggest impact of the 1900 tour was the effect it had back in the West Indies. Black West Indians had gone to the mother country and largely been accepted as equals by their opponents and treated seriously as players. It was a massive boost for their confidence and a serious blow for those who sought to justify resisting integration.